Coming up on Chopper's Politics. Look, the world has changed radically in 5 days. Imagine what it's going to be like in 2 years' time. So whatever you vote through now, you've got to think not in the usual way, oh, well, it'll last a parliament and that's kind of fine. No, this is an emergency bill for a specific purpose in a world that is changing incredibly fast.
Hello, I'm Christopher Hope, the Telegraph's chief political correspondent, and welcome to Chopper's Politics. In these times of social distancing, it wouldn't seem right to be occupying my usual stool in the Red Lion pub, just over the road from the House of Parliament. So today, I'm interviewing my guests around Parliament using various bits of technology, but mostly using this phone and a microphone. I hope it works. Westminster this week was of course focused on just one subject. Schools are closed from Friday, 40 tube stations in the capital are likely to be closed, and even the EU's Brexit negotiator, Michel Barnier, said he had tested positive for coronavirus. Photos this week from the House of Commons showed a sea of green benches behind Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, during PMQs on Wednesday. And only MPs with questions were allowed into the chamber, although 70-year-old Jeremy Corbyn was still on the front bench despite falling into this high-risk age bracket. So while the majority of the country is working from home, should MPs do the same? Well, I'll be discussing just that with Bambos Charambalous MP, Labour member of the House of Commons Procedure Committee. I'm also talking to Tom Tugendhat, the Tory chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee. But first up, I went to see Gordon Rayner, the Telegraph's political editor, to ask him two things. What does coronavirus mean for Brexit? And how on earth will the government get through this? Now, Gordon, daily you're going to these evening press conferences with Boris Johnson when he's asked about anything that can happen. But I thought what was a very interesting question on Wednesday was, will he try and extend the transition period beyond the end of this year when we're still bound by EU rules? That's and the answer was interesting. Gordon?
Well, the Telegraph reported earlier in the week that there are conversations going on in Whitehall about possibly extending the transition period beyond December the 31st, which is something which is being hugely talked about in Westminster, given that we're in the middle of the biggest crisis any of us have known, and it seems pretty unlikely that they're going to be able to conclude the trade talks that need to have advanced sufficiently by the summer for the government to have a trade deal ready by the end of December. So the Prime Minister, as you say, was asked, is it possible now that you could extend the implementation period beyond December? Now, Downing Street had furiously denied that this could be the case, but the Prime Minister's answer was much more equivocal. He said that the implementation period, he said, is not a subject that is being regularly discussed. He said, there is legislation in place that I have no intention of changing. Now, he has no intention of changing it, he says, but obviously intentions can change and laws can be changed. So It's definitely left wriggle room there for the IP to be extended.
In summary, not a no then. And what's interesting about Thursday morning is the trade bill has been published, which allows the UK to trade freely with other non-EU countries after we leave the transition period at the end of this year. Yeah. It doesn't say when it will come in. It says it will come in before the end of the transition period, which is... So I think this whole idea of the December 31st is rapidly moving to the right, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that part of the reason for publishing the trade bill is to try to give the impression that things are still on track, that things are still moving forward, that the legislation that needs to be in place to leave the EU completely at the end of this year is in place. But I don't think there are many people outside Downing Street now who honestly believe that we are going to do anything other than extend the transition period for a matter of perhaps months or a year or so. And frankly, I don't think many people would blame Boris Johnson if he did. I mean, he has said that he wouldn't do it, but, that was in a very different world from the one we're living in right now.
And of course, he said he wouldn't do it, didn't he, about October 31st, and then events took over there with the paralysis in Parliament. So perhaps people might forgive him that.
Well, and I mean, look at what's happened in the last week. A week or so ago, we were talking about school closures being something that was a long way off, if at all. The impression that Downing Street were trying to give was that we probably wouldn't be closing schools before the summer because that was a bad thing to do. It was counterproductive. And then lo and behold, within days, that's exactly what they've done. So nothing, you can't rule anything out at the moment at all.
And indeed, we are in Parliament here working through this coronavirus bill. It's a big document, 330 pages long.
Yeah.
It's quite dramatic, though, that the scale of the reach of powers that the executive wants is staggering. Gordon.
Yeah. I think the most striking thing looking through the bill that's been published is that how few specifics there are in it. And what I mean by that is that rather than saying we have the power to shut down certain types of shops or pubs or restaurants, the language is very, very broad ranging. It just talks about having the power to restrict the movement of people in or out of any premises they want, to close down premises, to restrict people from gathering. Basically, it's giving the government a carte blanche to do anything that they feel is necessary.
And on that very point, that makes it unlikely you can go through in its current form to avoid splitting the House when Labour come to look at it. They want to have a 6-month sunset rather than as much as 2.5 years. These powers could be in place if no one challenges the government's plans till September 2022.
Yeah, and you can understand why Labour are making that point. I mean, these are powers that no government has had since the war, and possibly, I mean, neither you or I are old enough to remember it, obviously, but possibly even beyond powers that governments had during the war, because certainly, as far as I'm aware, the government wasn't closing down shops against their will during the war, quite the opposite. So you can understand the nervousness at seeing something as, huge and sweeping as this, and the idea that it could be in place for 2 years.
Gordon Rayner, thank you so much for coming on Choppers Politics. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
My next guest is Tom Tugendhat, the Tory chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, who spent Thursday morning grilling Dominic Raab, the Foreign Secretary, about the UK's approach to coronavirus. And I met him in his office in Portcullis House. Tom, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Welcome to my office.
I do appreciate you doing this, such as the staffing issues here. I mean, there's only who's left in Parliament. It's MPs and a few journalists. That's about it. All the officials have gone home. Your staff have left. Everything else?
Absolutely. And I'm only here because, as you know, there's a very important bill coming forward on the Coronavirus Powers Act, really, which is an extraordinary power grab by the government, and we've just got to make sure they're taking the appropriate powers and using them responsibly.
And we're sitting here on Thursday lunchtime. We haven't seen the bill yet. Now, the rumour is there aren't enough clerks in the Commons to write it all down because everyone's been sent home. So the problem is just getting this out and getting it looked at. But there are some concerns from civil liberties grounds, aren't there?
Well, I think there are some concerns that you can reasonably have, and this is nothing to do with trust in the government or wider civil liberties issues, but really on the rather more precise issue that, look, the world has changed radically in 5 days. Imagine what it's going to be like in 2 years' time. So whatever you vote through now, you've got to think not in the usual way, oh, well, it'll last a parliament and that's kind of fine. No, this is an emergency bill for a specific purpose in a world that is changing incredibly fast. So having a review element in there, now I would rather have a review at least every 3 months, but, I can understand the government making an argument for a bit longer, is absolutely essential.
Exactly, Tom, and we'll wait to see how that appears. How do you rate generally the UK response to this crisis? You've been grilling Dominic Raab, the Foreign Secretary, on Thursday morning. How did he come across? Has he got a grip? How are his officials working? What's your view of it all?
Well, look, I think, first of all, I'd like to pay tribute to Foreign Office staff around the world who are carrying on doing their jobs in extraordinarily difficult circumstances, serving our country in far-flung places, and doing so very often under enormous pressure. I mean, we've got to say thank you. But look, there's a lot more that we need to do. And one of the things that came out of a session that we had as a committee with Professor Harper, an epidemiologist and professor who now works at Chatham House, but used to work at the Department of Health and the World Health Organization. When he worked on Ebola, one of the things that he was telling us was that there's a few things you've really got to get on with immediately. And one is actually, oddly perhaps, learning lessons as you go, because if you don't improve as you go. So we're really pushing the government to make sure that they're constantly learning and updating. The second thing that he said, which was so important, he said in Ebola and in H1N1, was the clarity of the message. And that's something that I'd really like to see a lot of emphasis go into, because if you have confusion in the message in any way, even in the slightest way, what you lead to is confusion in action, and that can lead to people making the wrong decisions for themselves and their families.
On messaging, it has been quite confusing, I think, in the past 24 hours. The government didn't really sit on the idea of a lockdown in London over this weekend. In fact, the PM was asked about it and didn't say it wasn't going to happen. And that's part of the problem, I think, is a lack of clarity on some of the comments coming out of Number 10.
All I can say is I've got a lot of sympathy for the government at the moment. This is a very, very fast-moving situation, and a lot of things that we wish we would never even be talking about are now actually happening, including, many of us will have said goodbye to our parents not very long ago, and be very much hoping that we will be seeing them again in a few weeks and months. But I certainly won't be seeing my parents on Mother's Day. Today they're missing my son's birthday. And they're going to be missing many other events in coming weeks and months. And that's really hard as a family, as I'm sure many of your listeners will understand.
But we're all doing that, and you're doing that as an MP, I'm doing it as a journalist. These guys are in charge of the actual national, the fate is in their hands, isn't it?
Well, it is. And, what we need to do now is we need to have absolute clarity. Look, I think we've got to look at this as a wartime effort, frankly. The enemy is a different one. The enemy is invisible rather than visible. But we've got to talk about the whole country pulling together. I would like to see a volunteer army mobilised. And the reason I'd like to see that is because we need to not only be able to respond, but actually we need to be able to feel that we are part of that fight too. This isn't something that's being done to us. It's something we can do together. And that's why we need to work together. We need to mobilise together as communities, but also the government needs to get behind it.
So who's in this volunteer army? Dad's army?
Not at all. No, it's everybody from Dad's army to Kids' army. Look, we all know that there's growing pressure on the NHS. You only have to look at what's happening in Italy and now in France to see that it's, the trained staff need to be on the front line. They need to be operating the ventilators. They need to be treating the patients. They need to be really out there. But they too are going to be facing sickness at work and people not able to come in for any number of different reasons. So that leaves gaps in things like cleaners, looking after people at home in adult social care, looking after kids of those who are actually police officers or nurses or whatever they happen to be. We need to make sure that we are, as a community, responding to that. And that volunteer army can be organised locally, of course. And by the way, parishes in West Kent are doing an amazing job at doing that. But also looking at how we can do so nationally. And I'd really like to see the government step up, the Duke of Cambridge volunteers, championed by the Duke of Cambridge, to get on and really motivate this.
Have you raised it yet with the Palace?
Well, I haven't raised it with the Palace. I've raised it with others.
With some people near the Duke of Cambridge.
I've raised it with people in government.
It sounds like an idea. Of course, as red tape gets in the way of that, doesn't it? I mean, if you want to have people going into hospitals to help clear up, then who have they been vetted, checked? There's always all those concerns you'd have. The state will be saying, "Are you sure? Are you sure that's right, Tom?"
Chris, look, you've got to be reasonable about risk taking. I remember on operations in Afghanistan, people saying, "Have you health and safety that?" And of course, it was always said as a joke, because the real health and safety risk was the fact that the Taliban had planted a mine underneath you. So the real thing that you've got to look at whenever you're taking a risk assessment of something like this is, where is the real risk? And at the moment, the real risk is the potential overwhelming of the NHS that we know about. So we've got to get resources forward, and the potential abandonment of some people in their homes who feel that they have to self-isolate but don't have a support network. So those are the real priority risks. Now, how can we address them fast? Now, I would love to see in this emergency bill that's coming forward an aggravating offence, which is to exploit the coronavirus to do somebody harm, or to exploit their vulnerability to do them harm. I think should be an aggravating element to a crime were it to happen. So I think we should, I think we can factor that in. But I also think that we really need to mobilise as a community and a country to get ourselves into the right position.
And what's the framework for that? Scouts or guides or voluntary bodies? I don't know who might be the guide, the kind of the structure for that.
Well, look, there's already many different bodies that exist. The St John's Ambulance, the British Red Cross, who operate a reserve system. There's any number of different hospitals, have friends networks. There are many different organisations that could do this, and I don't think that the government should replicate that. But what it could do is it could pull them together.
When do you think this will end? What's your advice to people isolating this weekend and going forward? You're a man of great resilience with your forces background. What's your advice to them?
Well, there's any number of different things that we should all be thinking about. First of all, any relatives or friends who are vulnerable, of course, and making sure that we stay in touch with them, because at a time like this, isolation can lead to real loneliness for very obvious reasons. And so staying in touch with people on the phone, on Skype, on FaceTime, whatever it happens to be, is hugely important. But it's also thinking about yourself, think about your own welfare, thinking about how you can get a bit of exercise yourself. If you're actually isolated inside, you can actually do quite a lot of exercise at home. And I know it sounds silly, but actually it can really help with your own mental health.
What's your tip?
You wouldn't be able to tell, but I have been known to do some press-ups and sit-ups, and it does actually help. I know it sounds odd, but it does. And then the other thing to do, of course, is to keep listening to the advice. Please don't overwhelm the services, but nhs.uk has a fantastic page on this, and listen to the news sites. Read the Daily Telegraph.
And the UK's response, there's been some criticism of it, hasn't it? Do you think that they've gone through the step change, the gears in the right order, in the right speed?
Well, look, I'm delighted that the government has looked at what's happening in Italy and has realised the scale of the situation that we're facing. I think it's extremely important that we respond as a community and as a country incredibly strongly to this. We are genuinely facing one of the biggest public health emergencies this country has been through in generations. And it is incumbent on all of us to respond appropriately.
When will it end, Tom Tugendhat?
Well, I'm afraid I can't answer that. I just don't know.
And what's the exit? Theresa May raised this, didn't she, in Prime Minister's questions, and that question to Boris Johnson, he had no answer.
Well, to be fair to him, I don't think anybody else does either. The reality is we've got to take this hour by hour and day by day and see what happens. But what we've got to do really is keep ourselves together as a community and a country, keep thinking of each other, be kind and be aware of each other's needs.
One final question on Brexit. Boris Johnson in his press conference didn't say for sure that the transition period will not be extended. Now, what's your take on that?
Well, we've just heard that Michel Barnier has got coronavirus. So if the other side's chief negotiator is unable to participate, then I think we've got to be realistic that the point of these talks is to serve the interests of the British people and leave in an appropriate way, and not simply to be fixed to an arbitrary timeline when the situation has changed because of a very major public health emergency.
Well, if you had to tweet some advice to our listeners of this podcast, what will your tweet say?
Oh, definitely be download some more podcasts, because we're going to be in this for the long haul.
Tom Tugendhat, thank you so much for coming on Choppers Politics. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Right, stay with us. In just a moment, I'll be joined by Labour MP Bambos Charambalous. Right after this.
Go beyond the headlines with the Telegraph's daily coronavirus podcast, a roundup of the latest news on the pandemic from our leading journalists, with analysis on the impact of health, business and travel every weekday evening. Search Coronavirus the Latest on your podcast app.
Right, back on the podcast. I'm joined now by Bambos Charambalous, Labour member of the House of Commons Procedure Committee, a Labour whip, and Labour Shadow Justice Minister. Bambos, welcome to Choppers Politics.
Good to be here.
It's good to be here. It's my first ever one doing it through my phone, but how is life different for you as an MP?
We're just trying to get by at the moment, so all my staff are working from home, and we're just trying to allow the House to function as best it can, but also being sensitive about people who are self-isolating.
And how is the House functioning? I saw from the press gallery on Wednesday, MPs sitting quite a long way apart, weren't they, on the green benches to socially distance from each other?
Yeah, we want people to be sensible. We also want to make sure that Parliament is able to do its business. We don't want to be giving conflicting advice to the public and not behaving the same way ourselves.
And it must be a bad look, wouldn't it, to all jam in together, squeeze in together for voting. How do you think things might change over the next few weeks?
Well, hopefully we won't have any divisions unless absolutely necessary. So hopefully there'll be more cooperation amongst MPs, and we'll try and get through whatever business we can. These are extraordinary times, and we do need to make sure that the House is able to function, that important business is done, but we cut back on things that aren't necessarily as important.
Do you think Parliament will return after Easter? Let's start with that point.
I think it should return, but
will it?
Well, I don't know. We've just had the business statement from the Leader of the House. So clearly he's indicated that we've got business up until the 31st of March. That might change. But before Parliament rises, he would have to give an indication of when Parliament's due to return. So I expect it will return sometime after Easter. But that's based on the best guess estimate as of now.
And there's rumours of a kind of pro-rata parliament. So you have maybe half as many MPs in all parties. So you shrink down the number of MPs are here to encourage social distancing and avoiding too many MPs rubbing up against each other and passing on this illness.
That's one of a number of possibilities. Parliament could sit for fewer days, so maybe instead of 4 days a week, maybe like 2 days. And there's a whole series of options that I think will be discussed, but we'll wait and see where we are in about 4 weeks' time.
You're the Shadow Justice Minister. Do you worry about what the executive might do without Parliament sitting? I mean, it's very important there's a democratic oversight of what the executive gets up to at this point in our national life, right?
Yeah, I mean, obviously protecting civil liberties is a really big issue, but these are extraordinary times, and I think we need to balance it with what's in the greater good and preserving public health. And I think these are very, very important issues, and it's getting that balance right, which is going to be absolutely key. It
looks like we will see Jeremy Corbyn in one final Prime Minister's Questions next week, given that it's been confirmed that Parliament should be sitting until the end of this month. I thought he did quite well this week. I'm quite a critic of Jeremy Corbyn, but I thought his questioning of Boris Johnson was really effective.
I thought he did very well. I think the tone was very measured, and he asked exactly the right questions that I think both sides of the House were asking, and some were very difficult. Ironically, I think the person who asked the most difficult question was Theresa May.
Yes, her question was, when will this end? What's your exit? It was a question which certainly he didn't want to hear, did he? And how was his answer? He basically fudged the whole question.
I think he did fudge the question, but I think it is because there are so many unknowns at the moment, and I think so much of the government's strategy is to get to the end of the week and then see where they are then. And the budget was only last week. Who could have thought that the budget would be a non-entity at the moment, and it would be overtaken by so many other events.
I mean, he found 12 billion, didn't he, in the budget for coronavirus? And now he's found 350 billion of support, but not actual gift to the economy, but support, so loans. Is that enough, do you think?
No, I think far more needs to be done. There was a good question in Duncan Smith to John Glenn today in the House about using universal credits to help support people. And that was something that did get support from our side of the House as well.
And what did John Glenn say to that? He, of course, is a Treasury Minister.
Yeah, I mean, I think he was sympathetic, but he couldn't give too much away because things are still being discussed. And this is what I mean by the government still working things out and seeing what the best way of dealing with things are. But there are so many unknowns, so many questions. I asked a question about dentists. Dentists are still practicing. They're potentially spreading coronavirus, but they don't know. No one's told them to stop. They don't know what would happen to their business. Would they sort of be able to function properly? And they need the government to get back to them as to what they expect.
Are you sympathetic to the government, do you think, in this?
It's an incredibly difficult situation, and I do have enormous sympathy for them. But I think they need to act quicker. Other countries have acted quicker, and they need to give the support out there. People are looking for leadership right now, and the government needs to step up and make sure they do the right thing.
Children seem to think they can't get it, don't they? And yet they can get it. I mean, it's not really clear, is it? A lot of the messaging is not very clear.
Obviously, everybody can get it, and everybody can spread it as well. And I think that the danger is if you give it to somebody who is vulnerable or has a bad reaction to it, then you're potentially condemning that person.
Yes, and overall, Bambos Charambalous, I mean, Parliament will keep sitting. It will still be this presence of watching what the executive gets up to.
I think we have to. I think we have to keep sitting, but make sure that we're passing important legislation and giving guidance and leadership to the rest of the country, and that the government is held to account. And I think it's very important that Parliament continues to function in that way.
Just that Theresa May question, when do you think this will end? I note that in China, there are no more homegrown cases for the first time in 24 hours that have been reported to authorities. Do you think then we can watch China? That took maybe 2 months to get to this point. Are we on the same timescale, or was it longer?
I think it'll be longer for us. I think it depends on testing. It also depends on vaccines. If they can get the testing sorted out quickly, that might help. But I think this is going to be with us for at least a year.
A year of lockdowns, a year of not being able to go out for a drink, go to the pub, all that kind of thing, or a year of just dealing with the virus?
I think there'll be a range of measures. Obviously, locking people down for a year, I don't see that being a long-term solution. But certainly, there being some restrictions to our everyday movements and what we do, I think we'll be there for the long run.
And Bambos Charambalous, thank you so much for your time today and a busy day in the Commons. What's your advice to listen to this podcast?
Behave responsibly, be safe, think about others, and follow the advice that is coming out from the government.
Bambos Charambalous, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that's it. Thanks to my guests this week, Tom Tugendhat, Bambos Charambalous, and of course, Gordon Rayner. Thank you to my producers, Elliot Lampitt, Louisa Wells, and Theo Luludis. But most importantly of all, thank you to you for listening. In these fast-changing times, we might not stick to our weekly schedule, but we're hoping to bring what we can, when we can. So please do bear with us and keep checking for new episodes. If you like this episode, please do us a huge favour and leave us a 5-star rating and a review on Apple Podcasts. Thank you to Captain Cuttle, who did just that this week. It really helps other people find this podcast. You can email us, chopperspolitics@telegraph.co.uk, or follow us on Twitter. If you don't already, we are Choppers Podcast. Until next time, cheerio!